Good afternoon. I'm Professor Kellogg in the History Department, and I'm going to finish the lecturing today, the topic for which is gender. And I am a specialist on gender, but my time and place is very, very different from Professor Simon's. I know that Professor Simon was talking about sexuality in modern America. And I think he's shown, among other things, that sexuality has the following characteristics: that it can be considered plastic, that is, it's variable, even how it's expressed can be variable even within each sex. It is constructed, that is, it is not natural, but it's a product of values, ideologies, and institutions that we have made a part of our own society, and every society does this as well. Also, sexuality has historicity. That is, sexuality and how it's constructed can change over time in patterned ways. And my topic for today is not sexuality but gender. But I'm going to be making similar kinds of arguments, that the way societies construct gender relations, and in particular I'm going to focus on the female half of gender relations, that it's plastic, that it's constructed, and the gender relations, too, have historicity. But as I've already said, my task for today is to take you to a very different time and place. I study a group of people who you would know as Aztecs, and I have these terms, but I'm not sure how they... Oh, okay, they're there. You would know these people by the name Aztec. And I have a series of terms that I'm going to use, and I'll refer to them on these sheets so that you can jot them down. The name that these people used for themselves actually varied because the term Aztec is a misnomer. But because it's the usual term that you would know this large population of people in central Mexico by, I'm going to use that term. The people who I'm most specifically referring to today would have referred to themselves as Mexica. And they were, the Mexica were a people who spoke a language called Nahuatl. They inhabited a large island city in the center of a lake system, which was located in the center of the Valley of Mexico. They were the last creators of an economically and politically integrated indigenous empire in central Mexico prior to the arrival of Europeans. Mexica or Aztec origin myths state that they founded their capital city, which was known as Tenochtitlan, in around the year 1325, that they founded this city on a small island in the center of this large lake system. And this city, Tenochtitlan, is or was underneath what is today Mexico City, and that's the region and the area of Mexico that I'm referring to. This account of Mexica origins likely is oversimplified, but I'm not going to spend time on what the ins and outs of what their origins were. What we do know about them for sure is that by 1519, and 1519 is a significant date because that's the year that Fernando Cortez and the Spaniards arrive, by the year 1519, this city of Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world. It likely had a population of around 250,000. We know for sure that the population was over 200,000. And also by that time, the Mexica had joined with two other closely related ethnic groups which spoke the same language that they did. And in the years between 1425 and 1519, they had undertaken a series of conquests which led to the formation of a large empire. This empire connected many parts of Mexico and Guatemala, or what we could call Mesoamerica, through the payment of tribute and the establishment of military and political subjugation to this empire that we know as the Aztec Empire. But what of these people themselves? What do we know about them? We, that is ethnohistorians or scholars who study the histories and cultures of indigenous or native peoples, actually know quite a lot about them. And one of the things that we know a lot about is their social roles. And it's their social roles that I really want to focus on today, and in particular on their gender roles. And I'm going to use this to try to talk about what this might tell us about gender in the Americas, particularly gender among Native peoples. And that's my subject for today, and try to focus on what the broader significance of Aztec gender roles is. In order to do this, though, I've already told a little bit of the story of their origins. There's another story connected to these people that I also want to tell, and this is a story about a woman, a particular woman, one of the most famous Aztecs. She's famous because of her role during the years of the conquest of the Aztecs by the Spaniards in the years 1519 to 1521. These were the years when the Aztec Empire was destroyed, and their political and cultural sovereignty came to an end at that time. Her name is Malinche, or at least that's the way that we know her name today. So I'm going to start on this topic by telling the story of Malinche. Malinche is prominently pictured in many accounts, both written and pictorial, of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. And she was the woman who served as Cortez's primary translator. Her name is given in various versions in these different sources, but her name usually takes one of the following forms: Doña Marina, which is the form it most often takes in the original early sources; Malinche, which we also see occasionally in these early sources; or Malintzin, which is the Nahuatl version of her name. And some scholars argue that that was likely the original Nahuatl version of her name, and that Marina was chosen for her because of its similarity to Malintzin. That may not actually be the case, but I'm going to use Malintzin as the Nahuatl version of her name. That's the way that I'll refer to her today. Malintzin and Cortez are almost always written about and drawn together in either the written texts or in the pictorial texts. And from 1521, the year of the conquest, up until today, they remain together in both history and in the popular imagination, particularly in Mexico. Just last week, and this was literally last week on Wednesday, March 26th, the New York Times had an interesting article that was entitled, and I'm not kidding, this is the actual title, quote, "After 500 years, Cortez's girlfriend is still not forgiven." And the subject of the article was the following: that the artists who currently live in the building where Cortez and Malintzin may have lived, they talk in this article about how they would like to have a museum in the building, but they can't, because there's still so much negative feeling towards her that there's no way that the building can be put to a public use. And I thought that this was very interesting because I was already writing this lecture, and it reinforces this idea that she has a very powerful image. It's very closely connected to Cortez, and this image remains powerful even now in 1997. All historical sources agree that she served as the primary translator for Cortez. And as he, during the course of the period of conquest, communicated with the Aztec leadership in Tenochtitlan, she was the primary translator. Therefore, her story has come to be the story of the ultimate collaborator, the traitor par excellence. This image as a traitor was no doubt enhanced because during the period of her life when she translated for Cortez and for other important Spaniards, she also bore Cortez's son. Thus, several things come together in her image: race, sexuality, collaboration. They all fuse together to make Malintzin the symbol, indeed almost the essence, of the beautiful, betraying, supremely treacherous woman. But what of the real woman? What do we know about her as a real historical person? We don't know when she was born, nor do we know for certain when she died, although her daughter stated that she died in 1527, and that seems likely to be at least approximately correct because she falls out of the historical record about that time. The Spanish accounts say that she was young when she came to them, though not a child, so she was likely somewhere in her adolescence. Who was she, and how did she even come to the Spanish? Well, she was a native Nahuatl speaker. She was born to a ruling family in a town that was under Aztec control, but not Tenochtitlan itself. The town lay between Tenochtitlan and the Gulf of Mexico, but closer to the Gulf of Mexico. After her father's death and her mother's remarriage, she was either deliberately given away or taken by a Mayan-speaking people, where she learned to speak a coastal dialect of Maya. And it would be these Maya, the Chontal Maya, who would give her to Cortez in 1519. These Maya had attacked Cortez and his men as they began their march westward from the Gulf Coast of Mexico towards Tenochtitlan, but they were unable to prevail. And so they sought to they sought to end the hostilities, and they sent to Cortez several gifts in order to try to begin a relationship. They sent him food, they sent him cloth, they sent him gold ornaments, they sent him several male slaves, and they also sent 20 women who were to cook and provide other services. The Spanish forces had several priests with them. I think there were 3 in total, and they immediately baptized the women. On this day, one of these women was given the name Marina. It's unclear whether, as I said, this was a Spanish version of her Nahuatl name or not. Personally, I think it's unlikely because I don't think the priests were spending time interviewing these women, and they could not communicate in this language anyway, in either of the indigenous languages anyway. So I think it's unlikely that we really know anything about what her indigenous name was. At this point, the Spanish were not yet aware of her linguistic knowledge, and each of these women was given to an individual Spanish man. They were given to men who were relatively high in the hierarchy of the army, and she was not yet serving as a translator. They provided personal services, both domestic and sexual, for these men. Cortez was, at this point, relying on a man named Geronimo Aguilar for translation. Aguilar was a man who had been shipwrecked off the coast of the Yucatan in an earlier expedition because the Spanish were sending many expeditions from the Caribbean, from Cuba, and from Hispaniola, exploring many different areas. And he was shipwrecked from one of these expeditions. He had survived the shipwreck. He had been captured by a Maya group. He had been enslaved by them and became fluent in Maya. When Cortez and his men appeared in the Yucatan on the coast, Aguilar somehow got word that they were there, and he was allowed to make his way to them, where he rejoined them. He was allowed to stay with them. He was given back by the group he was with, and he served as the initial translator as Cortez communicated with the Maya of the coastal region. Within a month of that time, however, Malinche was working in conjunction with Aguilar and Cortez, and from that point on she was paired with Cortez, not with the original soldier. The utility of her knowledge of language had become clear as the group began to make its way westward and moved out of the area of Maya speakers and into the area of Nahuatl speakers. And she was seen speaking with Nahuatl speakers that Aguilar could not communicate with. Then her utility as a translator made itself clear, and she and Aguilar and Cortez become linked with each other. And there's a chain of translation. As the Spanish then move further west towards Tenochtitlan, Aguilar fades more from the scene. and he is little mentioned in succeeding historical accounts because once they're out of the Maya region and the regions where both Maya or Nahuatl might be spoken, then his utility as a translator was no longer, he no longer had use as a translator, and she grows more important. In fact, a Spanish chronicler who has first-hand knowledge of this time says that in this period, Cortes and Malinche were actually often known by the same name. And this passage is interesting, and I'm going to quote it from the original text. In all the towns we had passed through, and in others where they had heard of us, Cortes was called Malinche. The reason why he was given this name is that Doña Marina, our interpreter, was always in his company, particularly when any ambassadors arrived, and she spoke to them in the Mexican language, so that they gave Cortes the name of Marina's captain, and for short, Malinche. In each of the Nahuatl-speaking towns that Cortes and the Spanish traveled through, tried to subdue, and make an alliance with, she then served as the translator. Perhaps the primary source of her image as traitor comes from this period, when she is said to have informed Cortes of a plot that was supposed to take place against the Spanish in the city of Cholula. She was also the translator when Cortes met the Aztec supreme ruler, Moctezuma, for the first time. By this time, Malinche was fully fluent not only in Nahuatl, but in Spanish as well, and she could directly translate. A few Spaniards were learning Nahuatl, and the accounts start to mention the existence of other translators. But in the accounts of the rest of the events of the conquest, Malinche remains central as the primary translator. Even after August of 1521, when the Aztecs surrendered to the Spanish, her story continued. In 1522, as Cortes's Spanish wife, her name was Catalina de Suarez, joined him in what the Spanish were now calling Mexico City, Malinche gave birth to a son by Cortes. But soon thereafter, Malinche was married by a priest to yet another Spaniard named Juan de Jaramillo. She and Jaramillo traveled with Cortes as he marched south in search of other conquests, and she continued in the post-1521 period to serve as his primary translator. They were gone from Mexico City for several years on what became the Cortes expedition to Honduras. But in 1526, Cortes, Malinche, and Jaramillo returned to Mexico City. She was pregnant again, and she gave birth to a daughter in 1526 who was named Maria. Maria Jaramillo, as I already said, would later state that Malinche then died in 1527. She was likely still fairly young, but she had certainly packed a lot of living into however long her life was. And she had lived a life in which she had been passed along by others, as if she was disposable property. And she had her family ties repeatedly broken, and seemingly not ever by her own choice. Is she a symbol of collaboration? Is she a symbol of women's subjugation? If we consider the gender roles of Aztec women more fully, is there a way that we can make sense of these fragments of knowledge that we have about her life? And so that's what I'm going to turn to now, this issue, the experiences of Aztec women. And what I want to talk about is Aztec gender roles and focus on the female side of that. Until fairly recently, I would say until the last maybe 15 years or so, most scholarship on both Aztec women and on Native American women generally has tended to take the European observers' words literally. That is, that these women were drudges with little social importance. The apparent disposability of someone like Malinche fits well with our negative picture of women's place. But both feminism and the influence of social history in the 1970s influenced ethnohistorians to begin to look at women in non-Western societies. Especially, they began to look at women in early state societies, to try to understand the relationships among several things, among the development of large, truly complex societies, the emergence of class structures, and the definition and construction of women's roles, to try to look at how those things are related. State polities, emerging class structures, and gender and women's experiences. Some theorists have believed that women were subordinated in all societies, and they look at women in different societies to try to look at how that takes place. Others have thought that it was not until the rise of class-based state-level societies that such subordination came about. If we look carefully at women and gender in particular state-level societies, such as the Aztecs, what we find is that the place of women was not clearly or definitively low or high. Gender was structured in complex ways. There are some observations we can make about all, or at least most, Aztec women, but some of what shaped women's statuses and their experiences in society was shaped also by their class or their ethnic positions. The most important conclusion that can be drawn about women's experiences and place in society, though, is that far from being disposable drudges, gender relations were shaped predominantly by a concept that I think is very useful, and that's a concept referred to by the term gender parallelism. But it's important to be clear about what this term means. The concept of gender parallelism refers to the idea that during the late pre-Hispanic period, parallelism between men and women characterized Aztec society. That is, there were parallel social structures and cultural configurations for males and females. Societies characterized by gender parallelism are not egalitarian in the traditional sense that anthropologists would refer to. That is, I would not say that they should be defined as being societies where men and women have equal roles. But nor are they societies where the male-female relationship can be characterized overall as one of gender subordination for women. Thus, the Aztecs actually placed a comparatively high cultural value on women's roles. And in diverse realms of life, women played parallel and complementary institutionalized roles to those of men. But it does not mean, again, that women were equal to men. Particularly in the realm of politics, gender parallelism coincided with gender hierarchy. And remember, it is in the realm of politics that Malinche enters the historical record.
But you're not talking exactly about patriarchy here.
I would not characterize this as a patriarchal society, though I think there are some aspects of patriarchy that can be seen in Aztec culture, but I would not characterize it overall as a patriarchal society. I also have to say that in general, I think the concept of patriarchy, one has to be careful with the concept or idea of patriarchy because it tends to be thrown around very loosely and is used in such a broad way that it almost stops having meaning. And one of the things I'm trying to argue about how we need to look at women in different societies is that we really have to look very carefully and closely at a whole series of realms to look at how gender roles are organized. I'm going to start this discussion of gender parallelism by looking at a particular example of how it was expressed, and then I have a lot of other examples that I'm going to go through, but I want to start with this. And here I'm referring to the elaborate Aztec rituals surrounding birth. The best-known birth ceremony carried out by the Aztecs is the first one, which took place immediately after birth. Actually, there were three birth ceremonies that took place. First one was carried out immediately after birth, and this was the ceremony that was performed by the midwife who had delivered the baby. After she cut the umbilical cord and bathed the child, the cord was then attended to, and the cord of a female infant was buried within the household near the central hearth. a boy baby's cord was sent to be buried on a battlefield. So that's the first ritual. A second ritual followed some 4 to 5 days later when the child was named. This ritual took place in the household courtyard. Again, the midwife was present, and again she conducted the ceremony. Other kin were present as well. And all listened to the midwife lecture the infant on proper Aztec behavior. And much of the speech stressed the importance of work. And it talked about the work that women would do and the work that men would do. The baby was also adorned at during this ceremony with gender-appropriate accoutrements. Elite male infants received a shield and a bow and arrow symbolizing warfare. Non-elite male infants received insignia of future occupations. And female babies received spinning equipment and female clothing. A third ritual was then carried out, and it took place from 20 days to 3 months after the baby was born. This rite did not take place at the household at all, but instead it took place at the schools of either war or public works or religion. There were schools of war and public works or schools of religion that all males attended and some females attended, usually during their teenage years. These rites centered on the dedication of the child to these institutions, and they were overseen by officials of these institutions, not by midwives. What seems to be symbolized by these ceremonies is the widening connection of the infant to the social groups of society. First, the infant is connected to the family. Then the infant is connected to the larger kinship group. And then the infant is connected to the wider society as symbolized by these educational institutions. The Telpochcali, which was the School of Warfare and Public Works, or the Kalmikak, which was the School of Religion. The rituals also demonstrate that from the moment of birth, gender was recognized as crucial to an individual's identity and future experiences. The rites further suggest and symbolize the parallel nature of male and female gender roles. Gender provided a symbolic basis, then, for the parallel structuring of situations, ceremonies, and even leadership roles. Thus, in diverse realms of life, women and men played parallel and complementary roles. Women held administrative authority in the female sectors of several important institutions. Some examples of these institutions were temples, neighborhoods, and in markets. Before I give examples to show the institutionalized basis of gender parallelism, it's important to consider what the underlying basis of this social arrangement was. And I think that there are two bases for gender parallelism in Aztec society. One basis has to do with Aztec forms of thought and culture. The other basis has to do with the structuring of the kinship system and actual kinship structures themselves. First, ideas about thought and culture. Aztec thoughts, values, and beliefs prominently featured dualities and complementarities. These sometimes emphasized contrast and opposition, so that you have male war gods who are seen as being fundamentally different and in some ways in contrast or opposition to female deities of sustenance, such as corn. But often these contrasts and oppositions were merged into a higher idea of unity. That is, most deities actually had both a male and a female form, though sometimes one or the other gender predominated in the visual images of the deity. But most deities did have both a male and a female form. And in some deities, these would also be merged together into a gender-neutral abstract quality or idea. Male and female contrasting identity was the perfect symbol of the dualism which marked much of Aztec thought. Gender parallelism came out of, I think, this basis of contrast and dualism, which so characterized the way that Aztecs viewed the world and the way they classified many things in their world. But gender parallelism was also connected to, and it had a basis in, the kinship system, which was also a very important part of daily life. The Aztec kinship system was rooted in an ideology of descent from both men and women, and this ideology of descent is known as cognatic descent, and that's this term here. Cognatic descent can be defined in the following way. That is, each individual connects him or herself to the kin group through male or female links, and they trace back the origins of this kin group, this cognatic descent group, to either a male or a female ancestor, or to a married couple, or to a brother and sister. So it's a very flexibly, loosely structured form of descent system, and its most important characteristics are that you can use male or female links to connect yourself to it, and you can trace back to a founding ancestor or ancestors who are either male or female. This kinship structure had important material implications as well, because both women and men could acquire property through inheritance. A woman could pass inheritance rights to land, to a share of space in a household, or to small portable material items. She could pass inheritance rights to her own children or to other descendants. Women's access to property is important because it has significance for understanding gender roles, as women clearly had access to independent resources. And these independent resources then allowed women to function somewhat autonomously from their husbands. And that brings us to another important point about women and gender roles, and that is that adult Aztec women were not legal minors in any sense. Instead, they were considered autonomous beings who were not the dependents of men. One piece of evidence which shows this clearly comes from an important source on Aztec religion, and this source lists the days of their calendar, and it describes the omens or the fortunes that are associated with each day, because each day has a specific either positive, neutral, or negative characteristic or quality that it's associated with. And this characteristic or quality was thought to have a lot to do with the individual's fate in life. The very first day of the calendar was described as a fortunate one, a good one to be born on. Men who were born on this day would be brave warriors or important rulers, and women who were born on this day were said to become prosperous, and that they would be able to show generosity to others. And here I'm going to quote from a Nahuatl language source that's translated into English and that describes this day sign, and in particular its implication for women. Quote, "She would have food and drink available. She would have food for others to eat, and she would invite others to feasts," so she would be generous, which was important. "She would be respectful. She would be visited by others. She would revive and refresh the spirits and bodies of those who lived in misery on earth. Of her fatigue and effort, nothing would be in vain. Successful would be her dealings around the marketplace in the place of business. It was as if it would sprinkle, shower, and rain her wares upon her." So she's seen as a person who can, through her own efforts, gather material resources. On days with negative omens, both women and men who did not work to overcome those could suffer misfortune. But the important point here is that both men and women were seen as responsible for the way that the day sign would play itself out as an influence in their lives. In many parts of daily life, women played institutionalized roles, which both reflected and reinforced this idea of gender parallelism. In markets, in neighborhoods, and in temples, there is clear evidence for women's socially recognized leadership roles. First example, I'm going to give several examples of the way that institutions show this parallelism. The first example has to do with markets. Markets were very important institutions in Aztec society. They were found in any town of any size had a market, and market exchange was a very important way that goods that came into local economies were distributed. Women were frequently in markets as buyers as well as sellers. In marketplaces of any size, though, women functioned not only as buyers and as vendors, but also as market administrators or judges. There was a certain position, and the term for this position is on this sheet of terms, Tianquispan Tlayacanque. Tianquispan means in the market. Its root word is the word for market, and Tlayacanque is a word which can mean either administrator or judge, and it can be used in a number of different contexts. This position is explicitly described in Nahuatl language sources as being filled by either men or women. And both women and men, therefore, carried out its functions, which entailed ensuring the fairness of prices, overseeing the production of war provisions, and assigning tribute payments to be paid by market people. Connected to the important economic role of women in markets, and in the major urban areas, the markets were very big, and they were a basic economic institution, and again served as the way that most goods actually appear to have been distributed through the local economy. In addition to their roles and their work in the markets, women served as merchants and craft producers. And there are some references to women in supervisory positions among both merchants and craft producers. And it looks like even in those realms, and by merchant here I'm not referring to people who are trading in the markets, but people who are engaging in longer distance forms of trade. It looks like there are some clues, again, to a parallel structuring of men and women in those forms of work, but it's not real clear from the sources. It's not as well described as this marketplace judge position is. Another area where women also played parallel institutionalized role basically has to do with the area of leadership more generally. Another institution in which women played a socially recognized role, and this was an institution that was connected to either to palaces or temples, is an institution called the Cuicacali. And the term Cuicacali literally translated means house of song. What exactly it was is not altogether clear, because some sources say these were connected to temples, other sources say they were connected to palaces. We do know that commoner men and women participated in various religious ceremonies at these places. But these places also served as places of judgment over unmarried, young, probably adolescent, like mid to late adolescents, maybe into the early 20s. They served as places of judgment for commoner men and women at that stage in their life, where they would be judged for certain kinds of misbehaviors. One example, which is spoken of very clearly in some of the sources, is that adolescent men or women could be tried in the Cuicacali for what the Spaniards refer to as concubinage. It's not altogether clear what Aztec behavior that's referring to, because the Aztecs don't place any particular value on the idea of virginity or not having, on chastity and not having sex before marriage for either men or women. So that's not what's being referred to. But what may be being referred to here was that there were points in an adolescent male's or female's life where they were to remain chaste. It didn't have to be a permanent state, but they were to be engaged in other kinds of activities, either connected to training for warfare or religious service. And at those particular times, they were to remain celibate. And this may refer to behavior which transgressed against that rule. When that behavior was punished, both men and women would be punished by being brought to the Cuicacali. Each would be judged by judges of their own sex. So there are male judges who are judging the male transgressors, and female judges are judging the female transgressors. So again, you have this parallel structuring. Also, neighborhoods had groups of elders who had some legal, administrative, judicial roles. Again, both women and men could hold these positions, and each apparently bore primary responsibility for people of their own sex. Also, in relationship to politics, the wives of nobles and rulers also were said to have some types of supervisory responsibilities within palaces. Those responsibilities, the nature of them, are not spelled out very clearly. So I can't tell you real clearly what it was that they actually did, and again, whether there's this exact parallel structuring. I think it's likely that there was some parallel structuring, but it's not described clearly. It is also true, however, that at the highest levels of governance, I talked about Moteka as the supreme ruler. At the highest levels of governance, women did not have significant public roles. They rarely appear in chronicles, either by the Spanish or by indigenous writers. They rarely appear in chronicles in paramount positions of leadership. And so we have to say that the record in the political realm is more ambiguous. But interestingly, when leadership itself and what the nature of leadership was is described in the sources, here's something that touches on gender, is mentioned, and it's mentioned repeatedly, and it's quite interesting. Paramount leaders were often described as needing to serve as both the fathers and mothers of their people. So that leadership is envisioned, I think, as combining paternal and masculine qualities with maternal and feminism and feminine qualities. And what I think is interesting there is that you get this idea of the duality and the contrast, but again, the merging. And it reinforces and it reflects this idea of duality, contrast, and merging that we see a lot in the religious realm and that I had spoken of earlier. So we've looked at women's economic roles and seen a kind of parallel structuring there. We've looked at their political roles and seen evidence of parallel structuring there as well. Women priestesses, I'm going to turn to religion. Women priestesses were also very active participants in Aztec religious life. There were both lower and higher level priests, and these were referred to by the following terms. The term tlamacazque, I misspelled it here, it should be tlama with another A, tlamacazque. That's the term for the lower level priests. The term quaquiltine is the term that refers to higher level priests. And both terms can be used for male and female priestesses, though female priestesses, like with other leadership terms, the word for woman is siwat, and siwa would be used also in these terms to modify it, to refer to female priests at the lower or the higher level. But what's important is that women served at both these levels. Though they did tend to serve in temples, especially when they served at the higher levels, they tended to serve in temples that were devoted to female deities. But they could serve, in those temples, they could serve as the lead or the head priestess. We also know, in connection to religion and ceremony, that midwives were functioning both to aid in births and in the ceremonies surrounding birth, and I've already given an example of that. Likewise, matchmakers, who were always female, helped negotiate couplings for marriage and working out who would marry who. But matchmakers also played important ceremonial roles during the extended periods of negotiation, as well as during the actual marriage ceremony. What can we conclude from all this evidence? I think it's pretty clear that the Aztecs structured responsibilities and ceremonies so that men and women participated in semi-separate activities and organizations, and these were an important basis for the organization of daily life. The organization of production and the economy, of politics and religious practices, ensured that women had access to positions of authority, and their access to positions of authority depended on themselves and their own qualities, not on who they were married to. While women did not serve in the very highest levels of political administration or governance, and they were excluded from the warrior hierarchy, they had their own hierarchies of leadership in the important institutions of everyday life, in the markets, in the temples, in the houses of song, and in neighborhoods. All of this activity on the part of women was further reinforced by the emphasis in Aztec society on warfare. Men were very frequently absent because of warfare, and warfare actually tended then to reinforce the existence of these semi-separable domains. And rather than undermining the position of women, it actually reinforced it and probably made it more important. An important question to consider after painting this picture and going through all this evidence is the question of what happened to these positions of authority for women after the arrival of the Spanish. The short answer to this question is that the new regime brought a gradual but clear decline in the status of Aztec women. This did not happen overnight, but it is also clear that by the late 16th century, women's formal access to positions of authority decreased, and the older division between male and female realms, semi-separable and relatively autonomous, gave way to a new, more hierarchical division between male and female domains. And this resulted in a clear reduction in women's formal statuses. Some examples of the way change took place after the coming of the Spanish are the following. First, in the marketplaces, the Aztec market judges were very quickly replaced either by Spaniards or by Aztecs chosen by Spaniards. And the name of the position was changed to alcalde, and females no longer filled that role. So that role disappeared pretty quickly. In Mexico City itself, that happened by 1535, so very rapidly. Another really important aspect of this was that one of the things the Spaniards wanted to accomplish almost immediately upon their arrival was to destroy as many temples as possible, which they did. And they put a lot of effort into that. And the indigenous priesthood, if it did not completely disappear, because some of it, of course, hid and did manage to keep functioning, but certainly in a formal and a public way, it did disappear. And again, the same thing happened, where the priesthood disappears in this formal and public way. Here, Spaniards substitute the Catholic Church, and priests and women have very little role in that, and they have very little role in the Catholic Church throughout most of the colonial period. There are no indigenous nuns until the mid to late 18th century. So their access to formal roles in the Catholic Church is very limited. Another way that gender roles change is that one aspect of the Spanish ideas about how they should change indigenous behavior has to do with the ways that Spaniards wanted to change family life. because there were some aspects of family life that they thought were essential to change, and that if they changed those things, then indigenous people would be better, they would be better Catholics. Polygamy was one of the first things that they wanted to do away with, and that had a big impact on women. Most men probably did not have more than one wife, because most men who did have more than one wife were elite. Some men did have more than one wife, and it was rare for any of those who did to have more than two. That was something that in any area where there was a Catholic priest, he was instructed to place a great stress on, to end that practice immediately. And Aztec men, those who could have more than one wife, who had the material wealth to do so, valued those wives because of the political and kinship connections they could make through those wives, and because of the labor that wives did in the household. Because I talked about how men were so often gone, so that their work was actually really important in the economic functioning of households. When polygamy ended, and it was kind of like the marketplace judges, it ended pretty fast, because priests put a great stress on bringing that practice to a close. It, in essence, orphaned many women, especially older women. And there were debates about what to do with them, and how would men go about choosing a wife, and what's going to happen to these older women. There aren't really accounts of what did happen to them, but it's obvious that it was a source of concern, that indigenous men and families were concerned about this, and they brought up this concern with priests. And I would think that it's likely that whatever did happen to them, the course of their lives was not too pleasant once their husbands were forced to make a definitive decision in favor of one wife. So ending polygamy was an important part of the family changes that were introduced. Another kind of change that was introduced was that Spanish priests would frequently lecture on the idea of the proper woman and how to be a proper Catholic woman. Ideas connected to that, some of the things that they talked about were chastity, which was an idea that had never really been one that was highly valued. Yes, there were certain points in one's life where one was to stay chaste, but chastity and virginity were not important values for these people. The other idea connected to being a proper woman was the concept of enclosure. And this was completely foreign to these people. The idea was that the proper woman keeps herself enclosed in her home. She doesn't go out into the street. She doesn't engage with people in public. She simply quietly carries out her tasks within the home, and says and does very little beyond that. And we have accounts of preaching in their language by Spanish priests in which they're expressing these ideas. So people clearly heard this message. How much it actually changed what they did is probably another question. But they certainly heard this message, and I think over time, Spanish ideas about gender roles and the proper way for men and women to behave did become more of a standard. But as I said, this was a process that took time. It did not happen overnight. We can come back to the question of Malinche now and try to consider how all this evidence about parallelism and the various roles and activities of Aztec women, what light does all this evidence shed on the more standard telling of her story? We can't answer all the questions, but there are a couple things we can look at. Why, for example, was she given away by her family? This is a question that we can not definitively answer without more evidence, and I think it's unlikely in 1997 that we're ever going to get any more. But both Cortez and his soldier, Bernal Diaz, who wrote a lengthy and famous account, and that was what I was quoting from when I talked about the name Malinche and how Cortez used that name. Both Cortez and Bernal Diaz indicated that she had been given by her family to the Maya group, who then gave her to Cortez. The most common context in which women left their communities of birth was either when they were captured as a result of warfare, And this is certainly a possibility because Bernal Diaz says that she was given away when her father died. Or when they married men of other communities, usually in marriages of elites, where daughters were given in marriage to cement political relations of either subjugation or alliance. Since this was a Nahuatl Maya transfer, this is less likely of a possibility, but because she had a stepfather, it is some possibility as well. Some aspects of parallelism also help to explain her behavior during the conquest itself. Accounts that refer to her always emphasize her straightforward public self-presentation with both Cortés and Moctezuma. They also indicate that in dealing with groups with whom Cortés wished to make alliances, that she functioned more than a translator, but functioned also as a negotiator. So she had this very clear, self-contained public self-presentation, and she moved beyond her role as a translator, working almost as a negotiator. Her motivations for these behaviors are not recoverable. But what we can observe about her public behavior shows a woman who was neither a drudge nor a shrinking violet, and appear to show a woman who was working out of her own volition and based, at least to some extent, on her own decisions, and not simply on those around her. The other point I would make about her as a collaborator is that it's interesting that she is always the one who is dragged up as the symbol of collaboration, when there were plenty of indigenous collaborators. And it's completely fair, and I think true to say, that had Cortés not had these other collaborators, namely the armies of the many communities that he went through along the way, who joined and allied themselves with him in order to fight against Moctezuma and the Aztec Empire. If he had not had those allies, whether he had her or not as a translator, the conquest would likely not have taken place. And I think it's interesting that she is always the one who serves as the symbol of collaboration, even though the effect of her collaboration, while important, is actually far less than the collaboration of these armies that join with him. Because he only had about 600 soldiers, and without the thousands of other soldiers from indigenous communities, he would not have had much chance of success. I think the story of Malinche, as well as the ways in which I've tried to suggest how one can put together this evidence with some of the difficulties of working with it, Malinche's story, as well as some of the other evidence, points to some of the difficulties of gender analysis, particularly as we seek to recapture indigenous women's experiences and statuses in what is the relatively distant past. And here there are two aspects of these difficulties of gender analysis that I want to point to. One has to do with the sources. Second has to do with what I'll call conceiving plurality or multiplicity. First, on sources. The paradox of women's history and gender history is that even when we go back far in time, as we have today, to look at a period from roughly 1420 to 1519, which is the dates for the rise of the Aztec Empire, to Cortés's arrival. In a sense, we have both a lot and a little information. If one carefully combs the historical sources, written either by Spaniards in Spanish or by natives in their own language, we find many clues to the experiences and history of women. We also find a lot of clues to how gender as a concept and gender roles were conceptualized and organized. Yet we're limited by those sources at the same time. We have some examples that tell us how certain institutions work, but in other areas, for other institutions, we don't have examples or information that fills out the picture. Also, we have to think about the whole issue of language. Until the 1970s, Latin American historians and ethnohistorians who worked on these kinds of issues almost completely emphasized sources only written in Spanish by Spaniards of the time. Spaniards who wrote about Aztec religion in the pre-Hispanic period, whenever they talked about Aztec priestesses, always referred to them as nuns, which implies a lower and more secondary status than likely they actually had. So the point here is that depending on which sources you use, that is really going to shape how you see what is happening. And in addition, we always have this problem of not having sufficient information on certain issues and topics. What were the circumstances under which Malinche actually left her family of birth? We can take some guesses about them, and they can be pretty educated and intelligent guesses. But it's not likely that we're ever going to know in the definitive way that we might like. So one aspect of doing women's history has to do with the question of sources, and as I've tried to suggest, there are several issues about sources that have to be thought about. Secondly, plurality and multiplicity. And by these terms, I mean I want to get at a couple of different points. First, until recently, scholars thought, especially feminist scholars thought, that it would be possible to talk definitively about whether women's status in any society was high or low. They thought that they could definitively answer questions about whether women have been subordinated in all societies or whether this is a more recent phenomenon. These questions, after many years and pages of scholarship, turn out to be a whole lot harder to answer for a number of reasons. One is that, as I said, the sources are more difficult to work with than one might imagine. But secondly, and more importantly, women don't really have a single status. And I would argue that this is actually true even in the simplest society. But as you work on or examine societies that are more complex in their organization, it's very clear that women do not have a single status. Class, ethnicity, race all shape a woman's status. Where an individual is located in society says a lot about his or her experiences. And this is true for men as well as for women. And it was true for the Aztecs. If we're going to compare the experience of a noble woman to a slave woman, their experiences, their worlds were vastly different. And it has just as much to do with their identity as women as it has to do with their class and their position in the occupational hierarchy. But there's more plurality or multiplicity even than that. Because I think it's also true that when we do look at women as a group, there are some observations that we can make that are useful generalizations. But it's also the case that women as a group can have a high status in one or several domains of life and a low status in others. That is, that there's no one status that really describes their position, and I think that that's often true in many societies. So for the Aztecs, in religion and economic organization, I think it's fair to say that women had a fairly high status. In the political realm, on the other hand, their status was ambiguous and often negative. Because not only can they not serve in the highest realms of political organization, but cowardice, for example, was often conceptualized as a female quality, and towns or peoples who are considered cowardly were referred to as women. So clearly there are some negative evaluations here. So plurality and multiplicity make it difficult to easily arrive at generalizations about women's status within any particular society or draw some simple sort of evolutionary schema by which we can talk about women's status rising over time or falling over time. I think that any of those questions are harder to answer and are best answered from the location, from looking within a society itself, and you have to look at how gender relations are organized carefully within specific societies. What we can say, though, about Aztec women generally, to finish up, is that like many other Native American women across the Americas, they were not simply the silent drudges of European observers who worked hard and disappeared when important decisions were to be made. And I think recovering these women's histories, both as individuals like Malinche and as a social group, women within society, that this adds a depth to our knowledge about the Aztec peoples, as I've spoken about today, or about Native American people generally, that simply did not exist before. It also means that when we want to understand the impact of European conquest and colonial rule, it opens up a whole realm of domains of society and patterns of cultural change that ethnohistorians and historians can approach in more complex ways than they have in the past. And if I can answer any questions, I will be happy to.
Learned a lot there. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do in the 10 minutes we have left is cover a lot of territory. First of all, talk about the different two concepts, sex and gender, and then talk about different kinds of feminisms, because I think that is pertinent for the discussions to sort of situate the two talks that we've had today. First of all, what is sex and what is gender? We had Bill Simon discuss for us sexuality. And the interesting thing that he mentioned was that the act, sex as in the act versus as in the noun, and a gender, is it a gender? Sex as an act has only certain finite possibilities. But despite those finite possibilities, there seems to be a whole variety of, an infinite variety, as he described, of sexualities, of attitudes towards those acts and possibilities of combining and doing things with those acts. Therefore, what we have there in that idea is the possibility of differentiating between two things, sex as the noun versus as the verb, and gender. What is gender? Gender is a concept that has come to that we've come to use in social science to refer to the cultural configuration of meanings and values that are associated with sex. So the question that I'd like to ask, how many sexes are there? What do we usually think of? Two, male and female, associated, defined by genitalia. How many genders are there? If we've said that in the case of sexuality, there's an infinite, perhaps an infinite variety. Let's look at his timeline. An infinite variety, especially here in this last little explosion of sexualities. There's an infinite variety of configurations of values and symbols and experiences and ways of doing sex. We'd have to think by association. Gender is also that meaningful set of domain associated with sex. So how many genders are there? Several?
Well,
how many is several? 2, 3, 17, 55?
I'd have to say, as many people are out on this planet, there are that many genders.
That's the extreme, taking it to the extreme, right? The whole idea of infinite possible gender configurations, right? But what happens is that we tend to reduce gender to what? To male and female. We tend to reduce the infinite possibilities of gender to two, back to sex. And this is a problem. So we end up talking about sex and gender collapsing the two. I'd like to ask the question about a native North American Indian custom called birdash. Birdash is a situation in which, in certain indigenous cultures, where a male assumes and this is, I'm putting quotations there, assumes the lifestyle of a female, takes on a husband, assumes the role, the domestic role, but also assumes other kinds of activities that neither a male or a female, a straight normal male and a straight normal female, would do. In domains of ritual activities, specifically associated with certain kinds of medical and dating and relational consultation, shall we say. The Berdache. So the question is, what is the Berdache? Is the Berdache a third sex? Is it an example of a third gender or a third sex? What would it be? It stretches our notion of gender and of sex because we don't have a sex-gender system that allows for a third. But in this particular case, it is uncategorizable by our Eurocultural descended system of understanding. We can only understand it as either a male in drag, or what? Nothing. I mean, it's just a male in drag, or he is a female, right? So we'd reduce it to an either/or option, right? And the possibilities of expanding gender to more than two is collapsed in our system. With that understanding, with that problem, I'd like to turn to the possibilities in 5 minutes, should I? Of 7 different kinds of feminism. Can we talk about 7 different kinds of feminism?
Here the women go, getting shoved under the rug again.
Hello. Let's talk about, oh, you can't even see this. Enlightenment feminisms is the first kind of feminism. Second one would be standpoint feminism. And I have here the next 4, which we could probably call, put under a third category as postmodern varieties. These 4 are postmodern varieties for the moment. Enlightenment feminisms take woman as their object of study. Well, let's start from the very beginning. What is feminism? Feminisms are, let's say, an intellectual and social movement aiming at producing kinds of knowledge that will serve political and social ends associated with, in the case of Enlightenment feminism, woman. In the case of standpoint feminism, gender categories or gender roles. We're going to have to talk about that a little bit further. Enlightened feminisms, which take as their object woman, a political and social practice or movement trying to develop political practices or knowledge that seeks to improve the social status of a specific category of person, woman. What is their kind of politics? The politics is based on sameness, a politics of sameness. Why so? Because these are Enlightenment feminisms that seek to say we're all, as individuals, the same, equal, and we should all have equal access, equal rights. So it's a politics based on sameness, politics of sameness, based on a notion of equality and individual equality. A standpoint feminism, of them which there's several varieties, takes as its object of study gender. Maybe I should write this a little bit. Gender. But as we've just said, gender seems to always collapse to women. Right? This standpoint feminism is called standpoint feminism. Why? Because it stands on the premise of a politics oriented around identity. The identity of the female, of the woman. Maybe we should say instead of here woman, the female. Politics of identity versus a politics of sameness. Here the idea is that the object of study, or the object of scrutiny, the object that is the subject who is supposed to be benefited by a certain kinds of politics, a certain kind of knowledge, is the female. The understanding here, why is it a standpoint? Because it's premised on a gender which is constructed socially, that constitutes a separate identity that is hierarchically, politically, socially, economically, culturally distinct from other kinds of identities situated in opposition to the other gender, other genders, which of course is reduced to the other opposite, the male. Other kinds of feminism, post-structuralist feminism. Here we're going to talk about 4 different kinds of postmodern feminists very quickly in a minute and a half. A post-structuralist feminism, which takes as its object of study neither females, nor gender, nor woman, but sex-gender systems. Systems of constructing relationships between sex and gender in broader social systems of stratification and value systems. This is a politics based not on identity, not on sameness, but a politics based on difference. There's different kinds of post-structuralist feminisms. I would put queer theory as one kind of post-structuralist feminism. But maybe some queer theorists would say that queer theory has nothing to do with feminism, and that's a big debate. Why do I put queer theory here? Queer theory argues that sex and gender is not an essence, is neither a biological entity or a socially constructed system, pre-given structure, but rather something that is constructed in performance. In our everyday attempt to live up to images of what it is to be an ideal person marked by one or more genders, identities, such as male or female. I'll stop right there.